All right, everyone. Back we are to violence. Couple announcements first of all, and this is in an email, but tomorrow you'll see a short little video show up describing the group projects. Well, that may be today actually. You'll see a little video in the modules explaining the group project, explaining how to find your groups, and everything like that. And so it shouldn't be, I don't think you'll find it too challenging or anything. And I'll kind of go over it again in the next lecture. But anyway, you can watch that one specifically. Other thing I do want to mention, make sure you actually do watch the lectures before you post in Packback. There were a number of people posting about how we talked about terrorism in class, but we have not talked about terrorism yet. We're building up to that. So there are a number of things that we're kind of doing right now in terms of, instead of just jumping in and talking about war and terrorism, we are looking at the social structures that tend to generate conflict, tend to enact conflict, and things like that. So anyway, just other than that, I mean, for the most part, the Packback posts are fantastic, and I think you do a wonderful job. But we are getting into some really, heavy stuff. So make sure that you do watch the lecture. Okay, so one of the most interesting and challenging things about violence is that most people think that they are in the right when they commit acts of violence. As it says there, it's a very small percentage of criminals who are actually psychopathic, or where they have a psychological condition that keeps them from feeling empathy, like regular people, or people that don't have that problem. So there's a lot more violence than that, though. So there are a lot of people who are acting, in their minds rationally, perhaps for a cause or something. And they think that they are right. So that is, one of the biggest challenges when we look at violence. So as I mentioned last time, I've done a lot of work in this area. There's another video in the modules of a talk I gave a few years ago in California about the genocide in Darfur, and we'll get into talking about genocide and international relations. Probably, I think the next lecture will get into that more heavily. So if you remember last time, we had ended on talking about the art of war, Sun Tzu, the sort of history of China and the development of this text that has been very influential across many different fields. So to start out, we're looking at powers that rise and fall. Human history is full of one person or one group or one civilization or one kingdom or whatever it might be being on top, being most powerful, but they always tend to decline and another power comes along. So Paul Kennedy, a researcher, wrote this famous book, an analysis called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And he pointed out that, if you look at a lot of, powerful countries, they tend to spend a lot on military, especially if they're expanding. And at first, they benefit because they have more territory, more land, that sort of thing. After a while, though, they have to spend more and more and devote more and more resources to the military. And then that can hollow out the society, essentially, by not providing money for other resources, for services, for example, for people in the society. So you often see that when powers do fall, they often, at least initially, will have a very powerful military. It's just the rest of society that's not doing as well. And so this gap opens up between how the powerful government looked and then the actual reality of the power. And you can look at, like the Soviet Union, Rome, and so on for for examples of this. So Paul Kennedy was focused primarily on economics. He was kind of solely focused on the material aspect of rising and falling powers. And while the material aspect is absolutely essential, I mean, most empires, exist over space, over geographic space. But that's not all that's going on. And oftentimes there will be many conflicts where, economics does play a role, but in addition and in conjunction with a lot of other variables, a lot of other factors. So the French philosopher Montesquieu, who wrote a lot about government, that kind of formed the basis for the American Constitution, the American government, he kind of argued for this moral perspective, saying that, that it's not, just material, and that it's maybe perhaps actually more moral than anything else, the ethics of society and so on. When we look around the world and look at examples of this, we can see, where morality plays a big role. If you look at China's history, and particularly as it relates to some of the neighboring societies, whereas now Korea, Vietnam, and so on, there was a general sort of agreement on Te, the idea of virtue in Taoism and so on, and it was kind of the virtue of the emperor, the Chinese emperor, was kind of agreed upon or recognized by the other neighboring and less powerful societies, and that's a good example of where you see economics and sort of morality and this ideas of virtue and so on coming together. So that brings us to Thucydides. So Thucydides was a Greek historian, and he wrote about the Peloponnesian War amongst various Greek Greek islands and Greek armies and so on, Greek cities and so on. And he pointed out that Greece for a long time was ruled by tyrants, and they didn't care about the people. They didn't care about the polis. Maybe some of you know that from a political science or philosophy class. Polis meaning the people, but particularly people involved in sort of decision making in politics and discussing the issues and so on. So he said that because they were ruled by tyrants who were only interested in enriching themselves and their family, the regular people and everyone else weren't really driven to achieve. They weren't really sharing those benefits, and the society then began to decay. Now, nearby Greece is an island of Sparta, and you may have heard the phrase, you have a very Spartan dorm room or something. That would mean you have like very basic essentials, nothing but just clothes and homework stuff and masks or something like that. So Spartans were sort of famous for being well disciplined in terms of their military, being ready to sort of jump into battle when they needed to be, and living rough. They didn't take on too many luxuries, and in fact some of the rulers refused those luxuries and redistributed land and so on. So anyway, what was happening here was that Greece was essentially decaying and sort of, falling apart, and Sparta was rising, and they clashed. And so ever since then, we call this the Thucydides trap. It's basically when one hegemon, one major power falls and another one rises. So example, Sparta in Greece. In the 20th century, in late 19th century, the rise of Germany sort of happening at the same time that you see the British Empire decline, and so on. And Thucydides trap is actually talked about quite a bit these days. Probably more than in quite a while, actually, in terms of major superpowers and so on. So Thucydides said it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this inspired in Sparta that made war inevitable. Xi Jinping, the president of China, said recently that we all need to work together to avoid the Thucydides trap, destructive tensions between an emerging power and established powers. Excuse me. So I think this is, this. If you remember when we talked about communitarianism, Amitai Etzioni, sociologist who is kind of a communitarian thinker, has really been focused on this for the last few years, trying to figure out ways to build partnerships, prevent a military or some sort of conflict between the United States and China. I think one can argue that if the United States is not completely collapsing right now, it's definitely decaying and needs to be rejuvenated or reinvigorated or something. As we'll talk about, and sort of the perception of some of the things that have happened very recently in the United States and how that looks for a superpower to have those things happen. Anyway, we shall get there. So when we talk about government itself, it's hard to go too far without talking about Machiavelli. And by the way, I know this is a lot of historical stuff, just kind of building the groundwork for the more contemporary things. But you kind of need to know some of this stuff to make sense of the world. So Machiavelli was a writer and an advisor to various powerful people in Florence, Italy during the Renaissance. I won't go through his whole history, kind of a fascinating fellow. He is kind of seen as kind of this kind of evil guy, as manipulative and so on and so forth, because of his famous book called The Prince, where he makes this argument that rulers often gain power through deception, playing enemies against each other, and they often have to rule by, fear rather than love, and so on and so forth. And it's important to recognize that he was writing at a time when it was one of the most violent periods in human history, taking place in Italy at that time. And he had been tortured and so on and so forth. So some of that was probably playing into his analysis. At the same time, we know that many rulers, tyrants especially, have ruled as Machiavellians. And if you remember some of the trolls, when we talked about internet trolls, some of them scored high on sort of Machiavellian traits, which are basically manipulation and so on. Machiavelli himself was not necessarily that evil, but he sort of was recognizing how power seemed to work. Now, as I said, we see a lot of Machiavellian rulers, tyrants in particular, who kind of flourish using these methods. However, there are many examples of people who score high on Machiavellian personality traits actually not doing so well. So a number of studies have been done looking at organizations like businesses, even fraternity and sororities, and a whole range of other organizations, and they find that actually people who have these Machiavellian traits don't rise as far in the ranks. They actually end up with less pay, less respect than some of their colleagues, their non-Machiavellian colleagues. They may suffer more social isolation and that sort of thing. One particularly interesting study was coding the strategies of U.S. senators by looking at their facial expressions, and some of them they had recognized as being more Machiavellian. And they found that those Machiavellians were less likely to get support from their peers in Congress. So, kind of an interesting study, and one of my questions is, okay, is this is this just a particular to this moment in human history where organizations, Machiavellians aren't doing as well as perhaps they used to? Or has Machiavellian been sort of exaggerated, hyped up or something? I don't know. Anyway, something to think about. So a little bit more history. Where did this system of countries even come from? So in Europe in the 1600s, you had the 30 Years' War, where it was just, a very, very bloody time period. I forget, the percentage of the population that was killed in these wars, but it was strikingly high. And it, pretty much destroyed, European society, and the Peace of Westphalia was signed. Now, what's important for the Peace of Westphalia, why am I talking about some treaty, from the 1600s? Because it basically created the system that we have today in terms of nation states with, clear borders, with their own armies, that sort of thing. You've had different countries sort of exist, civilizations, cultures, but what was new was a much more harder demarcation of those boundaries between one country and another. So this is the system that has, that we live in today. After the Second World War, as we'll talk about next time, essentially it was kind of like another Westphalia moment where decolonization ended, a number of new countries were created, and we live in that sort of, post-Westphalian time period. Okay, let's see. Now, just a reminder, Max Weber has this definition of government where basically the state, the government, is the organization that has the monopoly on violence in a given territory. And this is a sociological analysis, and I think it tends to hold up. I think it's very accurate, a very good way to understand how power works in the world. Now, one of Max Weber's students, one of his late students, well, let me talk about Weber first, then I'll get to his student. Another important thing that's relevant for what we're talking about now. So Max Weber gave this lecture called Politics as a Vocation. And as part of it, he talked about something called charismatic authority. Charismatic authority, he sort of was thinking about Napoleon and a few others who seemed to rule not necessarily because they were, ordained in sort of by God as a monarch, or because they were, just won an election or something like that. He recognized that there were these charismatic leaders that would pop up, every so often in history, and they would have, some sort of draw, some sort of charm, at least to some people, that would generate a mass following, and they would often use it to challenge the traditional order. So sometimes they were bad and they were tyrants, sometimes they were, maybe less so, and sometimes they were, very non-violent and non-authoritarian and that sort of thing. When he was talking about the ones that were holding power, he sort of noticed that a lot of them would only hold power for a short amount of time. And oftentimes then the system would sort of break apart, or the movement would kind of fall apart because, the charismatic leader, they're all kind of worship's a strong word, but kind of, following almost blindly. Now that leader is gone, so goes the movement. So examples include Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Napoleon Bonaparte, Jesus, possibly Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. I personally don't agree with that sentence anymore. When I first made this slide, it was about a year or two ago. Anyway, I would say, kind of on closer inspection of charismatic authority. I think Donald Trump fits there. Maybe Obama, he had a lot of charisma, that sort of thing. Trump especially, though, because Obama had these other kinds of authority that Weber talks about, legal, rational, and these sort of things that are pretty common amongst contemporary politicians. Whereas Trump, not being in politics before becoming president, it really was charisma and the charm and what's the sensation of his campaigns and everything. Anyway, a very, very interesting and I think very useful analysis from Weber, speaking to us from the grave of 100 years or whatever. Okay, so as I said, one of Max Weber's students went on to be a brilliant thinker and kind of with an incredibly analytic mind that he used for good and for evil. Carl Schmitt, interesting figure. He was a jurist in Germany, and as we'll talk about, at a certain time in Germany in the Weimar Republic, after the First World War, Germany was no longer a monarchy and they became a democracy for the first time. And so a lot of people were trying to figure out, okay, how does this democracy thing work? And Carl Schmitt, was able to identify some of the problems with democracy, or at least some of the challenges that it might face. He pointed out a couple of key things. Perhaps his strongest argument, or the one he's most famous for, is this idea that at the heart of all politics is a distinction between friend and enemy, whether that's collective or personal. I mean, it's just there's always this divide, and he's usually talking about public. No, I'm sorry, he's almost always talking about public, not personal. So he was during this Weimar Republic, he was critical of this liberal democracy, and at the same time, he was worried about the movements on the far right and the far left that were, gathering steam, the communists and the Nazis. And so he actually wrote, kind of these legal opinions that under certain circumstances, a sovereign leader, whoever had real power could, have to shut down democracy or whatever they have to do to deal with whatever the crisis is. And so he was very interested in that. So he argued that real power is held by the sovereign, whoever can actually suspend democracy and take whatever radical measures are needed for national security or whatever it might be. So, as I said, he was initially worried about the right and the left. However, when the Nazis did take power and they started, clamping down, a number of intellectuals did different things. Some of them fled the country. Some of them stayed and, ended up in camps. Schmitt essentially ended up being a Nazi hack for a few years, writing a few anti-Semitic pieces, as well as censoring some Jewish authors. And he quit the Nazi party, I forget when exactly, and kind of just stuck back to his scholarship. After the war, he was never allowed to teach again in Germany. He continued to write, and it's actually kind of interesting because he's sort of he's become popular again on both the political left and the political right. I mean, I think he's onto something when he recognizes that there's a divide, whether it's friend, enemy, that might be a little bit extreme. And as I'll talk about my own research on race and ethnicity and ethnic conflict, I think it actually is much more complicated and not so pessimistic than this. However, having said that, just everything we know about political and social psychology tells us that group differences are huge, and in group, out group, our minds are unconsciously doing sort of all sorts of calculations and stuff like that. So anyway, Schmidt then, after the war, continued his attacks on liberalism, at least initially, and then there's debate among scholars if his later works are attacks on liberalism or if they're actually defenses of liberalism. I am not sure because I don't think I've read those ones. As I said, he's a controversial figure. If you are worried about authoritarianism and if you are worried about totalitarian government, I would read him, but not as as someone who's going to have an answer to prevent those sort of systems from emerging. But you will see the arguments made sort of in favor of them, and if not in favor of them, at least against the idea of liberal democracy. So. And then he also had an analysis of kind of how the European system was globalized and then sort of taken on by America. And as we'll talk about later, most of the questions of order in the world and international law ultimately coalesce in a concept of just war. And we'll talk about just war next time, I believe we'll get there. Maybe we'll get there today. We'll see. But so war then is basically between states, between governments, nation states, kind of like Charles Tilley, as we talked about last time. He said, nations are developed to develop wars and, they go to, I don't remember the quote now. I'm not even going to try. Something about nation states are built by war, and then they go to war, and it's much better than that. But the main point that I'm clumsily trying to make is that a private war, say a gang war in a city, in Philadelphia or something like that, that is not the same. That's not really a war in the sense of how war has been constructed in this Westphalian order, where you have declarations of war between countries and certain legal aspects around it. Wars can only be authorized by and organized by states. You can have violence and conflict of all different kinds, but it may not be war in the same sense that it's been understood for at least the last few hundred years. So, where does ethnic and sectarian conflict come from? We'll talk about this more when we talk about race and ethnicity, but just got to at least bring it in here now. A couple of explanations. One is the constructivist approach. They say that, a big part of it is actually the role of leaders of groups that for whatever reason will stir up hatred against some other group. Then there's the kind of older view, the primordial explanation that says that, there are ancient hatreds rooted deeply in the psychology and the culture of different ethnic groups. Sometimes it's related to grievance and victimization and things like this. For the most part, it's perhaps a combination of both. England and France were, at war for hundreds of years off and on, and in various places, and they had the 100 Years' War as well. So, British and French comedians often still joke about, each other and that sort of thing. So that could be sort of a primordial explanation. Maybe not so much ancient hatreds right now. It's more kind of ancient jokes based upon ancient hatreds or something. When we talk about ethnicity, as I said, we'll talk about how there are perhaps between cultures, there will definitely be people who do fall into ancient hatreds and, prejudices and things like that. But it will often be, the certain political powers that will really ignite, violence and sort of militancy and things like that. So it's a combination of different factors. Now, just when we talk about power, kind of going back to Machiavelli and so on. What's very interesting, and kind of how I was just talking about how a lot of the constructivist explanations for ethnic conflict, it's the result of people in power. And one of the best researchers of power is a Berkeley social psychologist named Dr. Keltner. Wrote a book called The Power Paradox. I've done some fascinating research. He has this great quote here: "We gain power by advancing the welfare of other people, and yet when we feel powerful, it turns us into impulsive sociopaths, and we lose those very skills." So Keltner has done a lot of interesting experiments. And I think I'll post one of just a little clip to the modules. But he's done all sorts of experiments of people, making them feel a little bit more powerful in some sort of laboratory setting, and they really act like they have power and that sort of thing. So anyway, I'll post something about that later. So we'll be getting into just war. Oh, whoops. We'll talk. Yeah. So just war. Is this concept that's like it sounds, just war, meaning when is war just? When is it justified to go to war? Because this is about as destructive as we can be. When is it justified to do this? One of the early sort of elaborations of this came from Thomas Aquinas, the famous theologian, and the system that's developed kind of grows out of some of these ideas that he and others had. So for him, he looked at pure goal of peace, that ultimately the war is there to end at some point and make bring about peace and harmony, that sort of thing. Has to be for some just cause, not you just want to steal something that the other town or the other country has. There needs to be a formal declaration of war. It can't just be an attack out of nowhere, not letting the person know anything, and prohibition of untruths, that you should be honest about why you're going to war and that sort of thing. And maybe he was being pretty idealistic, and thinking that maybe they could have conflict without any deception or anything like that. So a little bit naive on the theologians there. Anyway. So when we look at the just war today, these are, I've got the 6 ones here. They're listed and worded a little bit differently there in that graphic. But basically, it's, as you can see, it's similar to what Thomas Aquinas, was saying. The war must be for a just cause. It must be declared lawful by lawful authority, governments, international organizations. There must be good intentions behind it, trying to, free some ethnic group that's being harassed, or, spreading stopping the spread of ISIS or communism or something like this. All other ways of resolving the conflict should have been tried first. So, try and, come up with some peace deal or something like this that will prevent conflict from happening. Reasonable chance of success. You don't want to go into a war that, you're going to lose. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for, Luxembourg to attack Russia or something like this. The means must be used in proportion to the end that the war seeks to achieve. So, if they're trying to just, maybe take an extra ridge that's contested between two countries, maybe that country should just fight to what they need to do to beat the armies from occupying or reoccupying that ridge. They don't need to go and bomb the civilian population in the capital or something like that. So anyway, those are all just kind of examples of how war can be just. Now, some would say that it can never be justified. I consider myself a pacifist, but not a committed pacifist, meaning that I do recognize that sometimes, violence and militant action is called for. When the communists in Russia took power, the Bolsheviks, they sort of had an idea of just war as well. For them, though, there was only one just war, and that was the war against capitalism. Basically, everything was subsumed under capitalism in the Leninist and Marxist analyses, especially the Leninist. Marx was looking more at kind of the economics and so on. Lenin looked more at revolution and war and violence and so on. And lots of people were killed. A few things that I think are sort of interesting. So the just war stuff is coming out of Europe. Europe at this time is becoming very warlike, different European countries and so on. And you start to get these ethics of war that develop, and ideas about just war and so on. And that's why you get these scenes of battle in the 1700s where you've got one side fully uniformed, you got the other side fully uniformed, and they're marching up to each other, and they shoot at each other from a certain distance. And this was this sort of rationalization of war and conflict. This is how Europeans were fighting themselves, and they started to, expand this to other places. And then, they were, after a while, they started to recognize that guerrilla fighters could pose a problem. So guerrilla fighters meaning, not gorillas like monkeys or something, but guerrillas as in these fighters who are not necessarily part of an established country's military and are often fighting invaders or an oppressive government or something like that. So guerrilla fighting, it's arguably has been around forever, but you really see it in the sort of the modern context in the Napoleonic Wars. And then you see it especially in the 20th century and into the 21st century. Some of the, let's see, I'll go over here, I suppose. Maybe over there. Okay, so some of the major works, for example, on guerrilla warfare, one by Mao Zedong of China, one by Che Guevara he started a number of revolts around Latin America, in Cuba, for example. And then Theory of the Partisan by Carl Schmitt, who I mentioned earlier. He also started to look at the rise of this new force. And the partisan or guerrilla fighter, they engage in what we call asymmetric warfare, conflict between unequal forces. Examples of guerrilla wars succeeding: the American Revolution, for the most part, that was fought in a very guerrilla fashion. The Vietnam War, or as people in Vietnam call it, the American War. There you had, actually, if you have the chance to, watch like 10 hours or something of the Ken Burns documentary on the Vietnam War. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. Anyway, that's why I mentioned that is just the guerrilla fighters in the Viet Cong that were the communists. I mean, they suffered intensive losses and far more losses than the Americans did. But at the same time, they were able to essentially, make America leave and get sick of fighting war there. So guerrilla warfare can be effective. It can also fail. Other examples, though, Afghanistan, you had a number of guerrilla fighters who were also well funded by the United States, but they were able to fend off the Soviet Union that was invading. The terrorist group ISIS, their initial takeover of Iraq a few years ago, that was a successful guerrilla war. So again, you see examples of it, plenty of examples of guerrilla conflicts being crushed too. One sociologist who's really done some of the best work, at least initial work on some of this, is a guy named Daniel Chirot, and he has looked at a number of things like revolutions, and looks at some of these revolutions that have, they basically have high ideals and are truly wanting to make the world a better place, and there's a tendency for them to fail, usually to bring about what they have promised. As I say, many well-intentioned revolutions have turned into authoritarian nightmares. This doesn't mean revolution can never work and you should basically, kind of give up on it, but you should learn from history and, recognize how hard it is to enact and create a new system, because history is in motion. You can't just kind of like wipe the board clean and start over. You gotta work with the mess you have, basically. There's a quote attributed to Mark Twain I like about this: history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think that's a good quote. So Chirot did another big study of modern tyrants. And he found a couple of major factors that led to modern tyranny: nationalism plus deep resentment against foreign influence in a weak state. So a government that's not very powerful, or, isn't able to do its job very well, providing what the citizens need and that sort of thing. But you still have high levels of nationalism and people saying, well, our society is decaying because of those foreigners, those people in the other country, that sort of thing. So you can see tyranny arise from that. Also, this can sometimes happen at the same time, sometimes separately. When notions of scientific certainty are applied to theories that justify, social and racial engineering to bring about utopia. So, the communist experiments in China and the Soviet Union in the 20th century, led to just mass death. Different, though, than the Holocaust. I'll talk about the Holocaust next time because it's important for the development of international law and everything. Although more people died in Stalin's Russia and Mao's China, it was different in the sense that they basically worked everyone to death, trying to build this better world. The Nazis, they're often compared. What makes the Nazi war crimes or the Nazi, atrocities kind of on a different scale, worse in many ways, is that they were actually actively trying to exterminate people, whereas, as bad as the Soviet Union and Mao's communist China were, they weren't trying to kill their people. They just kind of sucked at what they were doing and ended up killing lots of their people. Okay, so I think I'll end it here with this quote: "The tyrant grinds down his slaves, and they don't turn against him. They crush those beneath him." So tyrants oftentimes, if they're a good tyrant, then they're good at playing groups against each other, so they're not going after the tyrant. So anyway, so on Friday's lecture, we'll begin talking about the development of international law. We'll also talk about terrorism. We've got a lot to talk about. We'll be talking about Islamic jihadism and the terrorism, that was hitting around the world over the last 20, 30 years. We'll also look at the rise of white supremacy and some of the new domestic terrorist movements in the United States and elsewhere. All right, well, I will see you then.